She walked into my son's life like she had rehearsed it. The accent, the tears, the just right backstory about a family that didn't understand her. She had my son looking at her like she hung the moon. She had me signing checks. And she had absolutely no idea that the woman writing those checks had been watching her since the third dinner. By the time she put on that dress, she had already lost. She just didn't know it yet.
If you're watching this video, tell me where you're from or what time it is for you. My son Ronnie called me on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. He said he wanted to bring someone to Sunday supper. His voice had that particular quality to it, kind of careful, kind of bright at the same time, that told me this wasn't just a friend from work. I said, of course. I said I'd make pot roast. Then I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen for a minute, just holding it. Ronnie is 32. He's been careful about women since a rough patch he had in his late 20s, a situation he doesn't talk about and I've learned not to push. So when he calls me with that voice on a Tuesday, I pay attention. They arrived at 6:15. I heard the car in the driveway and made myself stay in the kitchen instead of going to the window like I wanted to. I heard the door, heard Ronnie's footsteps, and then a second set, lighter, slower, deliberate. She came in first. That surprised me a little. Usually people hang back in someone else's home, not her. She walked into my dining room like she'd been here before, and she smiled at me. Wide, warm, just a half second of shyness around the edges of it. And she said, "You must be Beverly. I've heard so much about you. Ronnie talks about you constantly." Her name was Cassidy. She was beautiful in that particular way that makes you trust people before you should. Dark auburn hair, loose and natural looking, none of that sprayed stiff style. Eyes that were a warm amber color, steady and open. She was wearing a rust-colored blouse and simple dark jeans, nothing flashy, like she understood exactly how to seem like she wasn't trying. Ronnie stood just behind her, and I want to tell you that the look on his face undid me a little. He looked like a man who had found something he'd stopped believing he'd ever find. Relaxed, easy, lit up from the inside. We sat down to dinner and she helped bring dishes from the kitchen without being asked. She asked about my late husband, Gerald, asked what he was like, what he loved, whether Ronnie took after him. She listened to the answers, actually listened. She didn't look around the room or check her phone or wait for a gap to make it about herself. Over the pot roast, she told me she worked as a pediatric occupational therapist. She told me about a little boy she worked with. 6 years old, couldn't hold a pencil without his hand shaking. And the first day, he wrote his own name. She teared up just a little telling it. Not dramatically, just genuinely. She told me her family situation was complicated, that they'd had expectations for her she couldn't meet, that they wanted her to marry someone from a particular circle, someone with a particular kind of name, and when she'd refused, when she'd chosen to live her own life, they'd cut contact. She said it the way people say things that are still tender, briefly, carefully, and then she moved on. I watched Ronnie reach across the table and cover her hand with his. After they left, I stood at the sink washing up and I told myself to calm down. I told myself the fact that she seemed almost too good, too warm, too attentive, too perfectly pitched, was just me being the suspicious mother-in-law, the woman who couldn't let go, the cliché. I had felt something, though, just for a moment when she was talking about her family and the tears were in her eyes. Just for a fraction of a second, before the sadness settled in, I had seen something else cross her face, something quick and flat and entirely different. I put it out of my mind. I rinsed the last dish and put it in the rack. I told myself I was imagining things. I wasn't. They got engaged 11 weeks later. I know because I counted. Ronnie called me on a Thursday morning. This was January, cold and gray. And he said, "Mom, I asked her last night." She said yes. And his voice was so full that I didn't say anything except, "Ronnie, that's wonderful." Because what else do you say? He was 32 years old, and he hadn't sounded like that since he was maybe 12. The ring was lovely. Simple platinum band, round stone, tasteful. Not what I would have expected Cassidy to choose, honestly. She had expensive taste in other things. but she'd told Ronnie she wanted something classic, something that lasted. The wedding talks started almost immediately. Cassidy had ideas, many ideas. She'd been thinking about a venue called Hawthorne Ridge, a converted estate about 40 minutes outside the city, gardens, stone terrace, the kind of place you see in the glossy wedding magazines at the hair salon. She'd been there for a friend's wedding 2 years ago and fallen in love with it. The dress she had in mind was from a designer in Chicago. She'd seen it at a bridal show. She showed me a photo on her phone. It was extraordinary, no question. Ivory, structured bodice, cathedral-length train. "I want to be clear about something," I offered. Nobody asked me. Cassidy mentioned just once offhand that since her family wasn't involved, they were trying to figure out how to manage the costs. And before she finished the sentence, I heard myself say, "I'd like to help. Gerald always said the wedding fund was Ronnie's. Let me do this." Cassidy looked at me. Her eyes went soft and a little bright. "Beverly," she said, "you'd really do that?" "You're going to be my daughter," I said. "Of course I would." She hugged me. Her arms were tight around my shoulders and she was trembling slightly, those small, fine tremors people get when they're holding back from crying. "You're more of a mother to me than she ever was," she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. I held her back. I felt the warmth of it completely. Over the next 2 weeks, I made 3 trips to the bank. I pulled $40,000 from a CD that Gerald and I had kept for emergencies. I liquidated part of his life insurance investment account. Another $35,000. And when the venue deposit came in at $52,000 and the dress needed to be ordered before a certain date, I took a line of credit against my house. My house. The one Gerald and I bought in 1989. The one where Ronnie learned to ride a bike in the driveway. I signed every check, every single one. And every time I did, Cassidy was there. Grateful, warm, present. She called me Mom. She told me she already felt like family. She talked about grandchildren with this quiet excitement, like it was something she'd always wanted and was just now letting herself believe in. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was giving my son a life. It started slowly, the way these things do. The first thing I noticed was the cash. Cassidy always paid for things in cash. Not just small things, everything. When she and I went to the florist for the first consultation, a deposit of $800, she pulled it from an envelope in her purse. Smooth, neat, practiced. I commented on it and she laughed and said she'd always been old-fashioned about money, that she didn't like owing anyone. I nodded and moved on. But later I thought about it. She was a pediatric occupational therapist, a respected profession, decent salary, direct deposit like everyone else. Nobody her age pays for everything in cash unless they have a reason to. The second thing was her stories. This one took longer to notice because I'm not the type to catalog everything a person says and cross-reference it later. But I started to realize that Cassidy's childhood shifted depending on who was asking. With me, she'd grown up in a farmhouse outside Columbus. With Ronnie's friend Derek and his wife at dinner, she mentioned being raised by her grandmother in a brownstone in Baltimore. At the venue walkthrough, she told the coordinator she was originally from a small town in Virginia, somewhere in the Blue Ridge. None of the details were huge. None of them were impossible. People misremember things. People frame things differently for different audiences. And the last thing was the guest list. 6 weeks out from the wedding, Cassidy and I sat down to finalize the invitation list. Her side had 16 names on it. 16. All of them work colleagues or friends she'd made in the past 3 or 4 years. Not one person from before age 28. No cousins, no childhood friends, no aunts or uncles or neighbors who'd known her since she was small. Nothing from whatever life she'd lived before she appeared in ours. I brought it up to Ronnie carefully one evening. Just mentioned that it seemed like an unusual guest list, that there was nobody who'd known her growing up. He got quiet in that particular way he has when he's about to defend someone. "Mom, we've talked about this. Her family cut her off. That's a real wound. You can't keep poking at it." I'm not poking at it, sweetheart. I know what you're just, he said, not unkindly. You're worrying. And I love you for it. But Cass is the real thing. I know it. I let it go. I swallowed every question I had, and I told myself that my son was a grown man who knew his own life. But that night, I sat in the chair by the bedroom window, the one I used to sit in when Gerald couldn't sleep and needed company, and I looked out at the dark yard and I thought, something is wrong. I don't know what it is, but something is wrong. 3 weeks before the wedding, on a Wednesday afternoon, I drove over to Ronnie's apartment to drop off the printed invitations. He'd asked me to handle the printing and addressing. Cassidy had been working long hours, he said, and was exhausted. I was happy to help. I'd spent 2 evenings addressing them in my best cursive. I had the spare key from years ago, the one Ronnie gave me when he first moved in and asked me to water his plants while he traveled for work. I'd never used it without calling first, but it was the middle of the afternoon. I was just dropping something off, and I thought I'd leave the box on the kitchen counter and not disturb anyone. I let myself in quietly. The apartment was dim, blinds half drawn against the afternoon sun. I set the box on the table just inside the door. That's when I heard her voice from the back bedroom. Not the voice I knew, not the warm, careful music box voice she used when anyone was watching. This was different. This was clipped and flat and impatient, the way people sound when they are talking to someone they don't feel they need to perform for. She said, I told you not to call during the day. I stood absolutely still. I wasn't breathing. A pause. Then, we're on schedule. 3 weeks. Another pause. Because once we're married, I have full access to his accounts. That's how we planned it. Her voice dropped, but not enough. Look, the mother has already handed over more than $100,000. After the wedding, there's the house. There's the joint accounts. She'll co-sign anything Ronnie asks her to. She practically begs to be useful. The room tilted. My hand found the edge of the table without my telling it to. 30% was the agreement, she said, sharper now, something irritated in it. Don't start renegotiating on me now. I've done the work. A pause. I know what he's worth. I ran the numbers before I introduced myself. A short silence. No. He doesn't know anything. He's completely convinced. I backed up 2 steps, then 3, then I was at the door. I turned the knob with both hands because one hand was shaking too much. I stepped back into the hallway. I pulled the door closed so slowly, so carefully, that I didn't hear the latch click until I was already at the stairs. I left the invitations on the floor outside his door. I don't even remember doing it. I just remember being in the parking lot and then being in my car with both hands on the steering wheel and no memory of walking there. I drove 3 blocks before I pulled over. There was a bank parking lot. A Chase, I think. And I pulled in and put the car in park and sat there. Then I fell apart. I'm not a crier. Never have been. Gerald used to say I processed things sideways, that I'd be fine for 3 days, and then I'd go completely quiet for an afternoon, and then I'd come back and the thing would be resolved. He found it both admirable and a little alarming. But sitting in that parking lot, I cried. Hard. I pressed my hands against my face and I let myself have 2 minutes of it. The humiliation, the fury, the grief for my son, who was upstairs right now in his apartment, probably thinking about his honeymoon. And then I straightened up and I said out loud to nobody, "All right, now think." Here's what I knew. Cassidy was a con artist. She had a partner. The partner was getting 30% of whatever they took from Ronnie and from me. She had run the numbers on my son before she ever smiled at him. The family estrangement, the cash payments, the shifting stories. It wasn't a sad past. It was a cover. A practiced, maintained, completely deliberate cover. Here's what I didn't know. Who the partner was. How many times she'd done this before. Whether there was anything I could actually prove. Here is what I was not going to do. Walk into my son's apartment right now and tell him any of this. Because I absolutely knew what would happen. He would be defensive. He would think I was jealous, controlling, that I'd finally found a way to ruin the one relationship he'd had in years. She had been building that wall between us. The careful implications that I was over-involved, that my concern was really about holding on. For months. She'd laid the groundwork. If I went in there right now with nothing but my word against hers, I would lose. I needed proof. Real, irrefutable, documented proof that even Ronnie couldn't rationalize away. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. I blew my nose with a McDonald's napkin from the center console. I drove home, and that night I opened my phone and I searched. Private investigator, my city. His name was Mitchell Greer. The website was plain. Gray background, small photo of a serious-looking man in a blue shirt, no stock photos of magnifying glasses or shadowy figures. That was actually what made me call him first. We met the next morning at a diner on Carlisle Street. Booths with laminate tabletops, real coffee in white mugs, the kind of place where two people can talk without anyone paying attention. Mitchell was maybe 60, with close-cut silver hair and the particular stillness of someone who has spent decades watching people for a living. He wore a plain blazer, no tie. He set a small notebook on the table between us and said, "Tell me everything." I told him everything, from the first dinner to the parking lot. I did not leave anything out, not even the parts that made me look foolish. He asked a few questions, specific ones, not emotional ones. Did I know the name of her employer? Did she have a car registered in her name? Did I know her full legal name or just Cassidy? I gave him what I had. He quoted me a retainer of $2,200 and told me he'd have preliminary information within 10 days. He said, "I want to manage your expectations. I can find out who she is. What you do with that information, whether there's enough there to go to police, whether you tell your son, that's your decision." I said I understood. I wrote him a check on the spot. He tucked it into the breast pocket of his blazer and shook my hand. I drove home feeling, for the first time in 24 hours, like I had done something. Not enough, but something. He called me on day 8, just after 7 in the morning, which told me he'd been at it early. I was in the kitchen. I set down my coffee cup and answered on the second ring. He said, "Her name isn't Cassidy, or at least it's not the name she was born with. Her legal name appears to be Cassandra Poole. She changed it informally about 5 years ago. No formal court filing we can find. She just started using Cassidy professionally. That's a flag on its own." I sat down at the kitchen table. "She has 2 incidents in other states," he said. "Nothing that went to full prosecution. In Georgia, about 4 years ago, there was a complaint filed by an elderly widow. Financial exploitation, romance fraud, the whole pattern. The case got complicated because she moved before charges formalized. In Indiana, 18 months ago, a small family business made a complaint about a fraudulent investment scheme. Again, she left the state. No convictions, but she's in the system." "And a partner?" I asked. "That's where it gets interesting," Mitchell said. "Both prior incidents mention a man involved on the periphery, but the descriptions vary. In Georgia, it was described as a male associate who made initial contact. In Indiana, it was a co-investor. We don't have a consistent name. Yet." He told me he was still working the partner angle. He said he'd check back within the week. I sat at my kitchen table for a while after I hung up. The morning light came in through the window over the sink, the same light that has come in that window every morning for 35 years. And I thought about Cassidy, sitting at my dinner table, calling me Mom, and feeling nothing while she did it. I thought about my son. Then I got up and I made a fresh cup of coffee and I went to my desk and I started making a list. Mitchell called me 3 days later with what he thought was a solid lead on the partner. A man named Garrett Hume. Early 40s, lived about 45 minutes north of us in a town called Alderley. He'd been linked, loosely, to a financial fraud case in Georgia around the same time frame as Cassidy's situation there. He had a record, One conviction for check fraud, 7 years ago. He drove a silver Nissan pickup. Mitchell had a current address. We talked about next steps. Mitchell suggested surveillance, watching Garrett's house, seeing if there was any contact between him and Cassidy. He quoted me another $800 for 3 days of observation. I said yes. Of course I said yes. We had less than 2 weeks to the wedding at that point, and I needed something. Mitchell watched Garrett Hume for 3 days. He got photographs. He documented comings and goings. He noted that on day 2, a woman matching Cassidy's general description, auburn hair, similar height, was seen entering Garrett's apartment. I drove up on the 3rd day. I sat in my own car down the block, which I now understand was not my smartest moment. But I sat there and I looked at that gray apartment building and I thought, this is it. This is him. It was not him. When Mitchell pulled the thread further, checked cell tower data he had access to through a contact, ran financial records, it fell apart. The woman who had visited Garrett was his sister. Garrett himself had been out of state for 2 of the 3 days we were watching him, visiting his mother in a nursing facility, completely verifiable. The Georgia connection was coincidental. He'd worked at the same company where the fraud case occurred, but as a line employee with no involvement. Garrett Hume was just a man with a bad check from 7 years ago and a sick mother. I sat in my kitchen with that information, and I felt something very specific. Rage. Not at Mitchell. At the clock. We had 11 days to the wedding. I had spent 10 days and nearly $1,000 in addition to the retainer chasing a man who had nothing to do with any of this. The real partner was still out there, still unknown, still walking around free. Mitchell said, "We go back to the source. We look at who she's actually been in contact with since she's been in your city." I said, "Then let's do that fast." We shifted the approach entirely. Mitchell went back to the beginning, not Cassidy's past, but her present, who she'd called in the last 4 months, what numbers came up repeatedly, whether any of those numbers connected to a name with a history. That took time we didn't have much of, so while he worked that angle, I worked a different one. I went back through everything I could access. I am not a tech person. I was an office manager for 22 years, and before that, a bookkeeper, and I can work a spreadsheet and manage a database, but I am not going to pretend I have skills I don't. What I am good at is patterns, noticing things, cross-referencing what people say against what the record shows. I went through every vendor conversation I'd had with Cassidy present, every email thread about the wedding where she'd CC'd someone, every contact she'd given me for vendor payments. And I started building my own list of people, peripheral people, people adjacent to her who might know something, who might have a piece of this they didn't know they had. Mitchell had told me one thing before we ended our call. The partner isn't far away. This kind of operation, the person who's running the money side is local, close enough to meet without a paper trail. That meant someone in our orbit, possibly someone I had already encountered. The thought was not comforting. What I needed now was audio, something recorded, something Ronnie couldn't talk himself around. I couldn't lose another week to a dead end. I thought about that for 2 days, and then I thought of the bridal bag. Cassidy kept her planning materials in a large tote bag, cream canvas with leather handles, a good bag, probably $300 at least. She brought it to every vendor appointment, every fitting, every planning session. It had her notebooks in it, fabric swatches, the little accordion folder where she kept all her receipts and confirmations. I knew the bag because I had sat across from it for months. The next bridal appointment was at the Alteration Studio on Mercer Street, a final fitting for the dress. Cassidy and I went together. Ronnie didn't come. Alterations were, she said, bad luck for the groom. In the car on the way there, I said I needed to check something in her bag. I thought I might have put the final payment receipt in there by accident after writing the check at the studio the week before. She handed it over without hesitating. I found the receipt, which I had put there myself the night before. I also, in the process of searching, pressed the voice memo button on my phone and nestled it into the side pocket of her bag, screen down, under a folded scarf. It was a long shot. I knew it. The phone would die in a few hours. She might not take a call. The recording might catch nothing but fabric noise and the seamstress talking about hem lengths. But at the fitting, while I waited in the front area of the studio, she stepped into the back to take a phone call. I watched her go through the glass partition. She was on that call for 6 minutes. When we walked back to the car afterward, I said I'd left my sunglasses inside. I went back in. I retrieved my phone from the bag, which the seamstress had set on the counter. I drove Cassidy home, we hugged goodbye, and I sat in my driveway and played the recording. 4 minutes of it was clear. Completely, unmistakably clear. She talked about Ronnie's investment account. She had the approximate number, which meant she'd seen a statement. She talked about the timeline. She'd said, "The mother is a problem only if she finds out before we close. After the wedding, she becomes an asset." She'd said, "Tell Denny I need the account set up by the 14th. Denny, the name was right there. Clean, spoken, on record. I sat in my driveway and I said out loud, "Got you." Then I opened my email and started a message to Mitchell with the file attached. My phone died before the email sent. Not a low battery warning. Not a graceful fade. The screen went black, stayed black, and when I plugged it into the charger in the kitchen, nothing happened. The charging indicator didn't come on. The phone didn't restart. It was just gone, completely and utterly bricked, the way old phones sometimes do without any warning or mercy. I stood at the kitchen counter with the charger in my hand and the dead phone, and I did not move for a while. Then I sat down on the kitchen floor. Not because I fainted or anything dramatic like that. I just needed to sit down, and I was already close to the floor. The recording was gone. Whatever was on that phone, the file, the audio, Cassidy saying, "Tell Denny I need the account set up by the 14th, was gone. Mitchell had never received it. There was no copy. I had not backed it up because I had been sitting in my driveway and I was going to do that when I got inside. I sat on the floor for maybe 20 minutes, long enough for the kitchen to get a little darker as the late afternoon shifted toward evening. Then I got up. I made coffee. I stood at the counter while it brewed and I thought, all right, you had it. You don't have it anymore. What do you still have? I had Cassidy's name, her real name. I had her 2 prior incidents in other states. I had a first name, Denny, for the partner. I had 10 days to the wedding. It wasn't nothing. It wasn't enough, but it wasn't nothing. I called Mitchell and told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know a Denny." 2 mornings later, my phone rang. New phone. I'd bought a Samsung at the carrier store the same evening mine died, and I'd given Mitchell the number. The call came in around 9:15. I didn't recognize the number. I answered it anyway. The man on the other end said, "Is this Beverly? Beverly Hutchins?" I said yes. "My name is Marcus Webb," he said. "I know you don't know me. I got your number from Mitchell Greer. He said it was all right to call." A pause. "I know Cassidy Poole, or Cassandra, whatever she's calling herself now. I need to talk to you." Marcus Webb was 54 years old. He drove over that same afternoon and sat at my kitchen table with his hands around a coffee mug and told me the whole thing. 3 years ago, Cassidy, she'd used the name Cassie Morell then, had come into his life through a mutual friend. He was recently divorced, financially stable, a civil engineer. She'd been warm and real and devastated by her family's rejection. He'd fallen for it completely. He hadn't known he was being used as the operational partner. She'd told him they were starting a small investment firm together. He'd provided his business license, his professional contacts, his bank account information for what she told him was seed capital management. He'd thought he was building something with someone he loved. What he'd actually done was facilitate fraud. The money moved through his accounts. The clients she'd brought in were never investing. They were being swindled. By the time Marcus figured it out, Cassidy was gone. The money was gone, and his name was attached to the whole thing. 2 years of his life went into clearing his name. He never fully did. There was still a civil suit pending when we met. He'd hired his own investigators. He'd been tracking her movements for over a year. He knew who Denny was. A man named Dennis Farrell, mid-40s, small-time financial operator with 2 prior fraud complaints. Dennis handled the account structures, the shell accounts, the wire setups. He was the money mechanic. Marcus looked at me across my kitchen table and said, "I want to be in the room when she's exposed. I want to look her in the face, and I have documented everything. Every account, every movement, every contact point between her and Dennis. I'll give all of it to you." I said, "Why come to me? Why not go to the police directly?" "I have," he said, "multiple times. Without a current active case and a victim willing to press charges, they've done nothing. You're the victim. You have standing. You have the money trail." He set down his mug. "And you have something I never had. She hasn't left yet. She's still here. We can catch her mid-operation instead of chasing her after." I looked at this man, someone I'd never met, someone who'd been hurt badly by the same woman, someone whose motive was entirely clear and entirely understandable. And I said, "All right, tell me everything." He talked for 2 hours. I took notes. With what Marcus provided, Mitchell had enough. Dennis Farrell was already known to the Financial Crimes Unit of the State Attorney's Office, not charged, but on a watch list. Marcus's documentation was meticulous. Emails, transfer records, account numbers. He'd kept everything in a fireproof lockbox for 3 years, waiting for exactly this moment. He gave us names of 2 prior victims willing to give statements. He had a chain of communication between Cassidy and Dennis going back 4 months, not phone calls, which were harder to trace, but a series of emails through a secondary account Cassidy used that Marcus had managed to access through a mutual contact who'd unknowingly been CC'd. Mitchell took all of it to a contact in law enforcement, a detective named Arroyo who worked financial crimes and who, it turned out, had been quietly watching Dennis Farrell for over a year through a separate investigation. Detective Arroyo was very interested. We did not go to Ronnie. I want to explain why because I know how it sounds. My son was being defrauded and I did not tell him. But here is the thing. Here is the thing I kept coming back to every time I thought about picking up the phone. Ronnie was in love. Or he believed he was. And love is a complicated thing to argue someone out of, especially when the person you're arguing against has spent months constructing the case that his mother is controlling and jealous and afraid to let go. If I told Ronnie what I knew, and he told Cassidy, if he confronted her and she ran, we'd lose her. Dennis would disappear, the accounts would be emptied. 2 prior victims and an ongoing fraud investigation would evaporate because we'd spooked the subject before we had her. I had one chance to do this right. I was going to take it. The plan that Mitchell and Detective Arroyo put together was elegant in its simplicity. We would let the wedding proceed to the ceremony. Cassidy and Dennis were planning to execute their financial moves in the 48 hours after the wedding, while Ronnie was focused on the reception and the honeymoon preparation. If we moved before the ceremony, we had conspiracy and fraud attempt. If we moved at the ceremony, if we stopped it publicly, on record, with witnesses, the emotional shock to Dennis might cause him to do something panicked and traceable. And Marcus asked if he could be there. I said yes. I said he'd earned it. The hardest week of my life was the week before that wedding. Harder than the week Gerald was diagnosed. Harder than the week he died. Those weeks I could cry and be held and fall apart and come back together. This week I had to perform. I had to be Beverly Hutchins, proud and happy mother of the groom, completely unsuspecting, right up until the moment I wasn't. I attended the rehearsal dinner on Thursday evening at a restaurant in the Westing district. Nice place, white tablecloths, candles. Cassidy wore a pale blue dress. She was luminous. She made a toast that mentioned Gerald, said she wished she'd had the chance to know him, said she could see him in Ronnie's kindness. Half the table teared up. I held my champagne glass and smiled and said thank you. She hugged me at the end of the night, long and warm. 2 more days, she said in my ear. 2 more days and we're family. I hugged her back. I said, I can't wait. I drove home and sat in the dark in the living room for a long time. On Friday, I went to the venue to check on the flower delivery. 180 white peonies, which had been Cassidy's specific and expensive choice. They were beautiful. The venue coordinator walked me through the layout, the ceremony space, the cocktail area. I noted where the main doors were. I noted where someone coming in from the parking lot would enter. I thought about sight lines and timing. That evening, I took the pearl necklace out of Gerald's old wooden jewelry box, the one on my dresser, the one that had belonged to his mother and her mother before that. I held it for a while. 4 generations of women in my family. Every one of them, as far as I knew, had given it to someone who deserved it. I was not going to give it to Cassidy. I never had been. But I'd told her I would, and she'd wanted it, and the wanting of it had been useful information. I put it back in the box. I went to bed. I did not sleep well. I got up at 5:15. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table in the early dark and I thought about Gerald, not in a sad way, just in the way you think about someone who understood you, who would have known exactly what you were doing and exactly why, without needing it explained. I got dressed, simple navy dress, low heels. I put on the pearl necklace myself. It felt right. It felt like an announcement. I arrived at Hawthorne Ridge at 9:30, 90 minutes before the ceremony. The grounds were already in motion. Caterers, florists, the venue staff setting up the terrace. The white peonies were everywhere, heavy-headed and perfect. The stone terrace was lined with chairs dressed in white, a chuppah-style arch at the front draped with greenery. Mitchell arrived at 10. He found me by the garden wall and we stood close together, keeping our voices low. Everything was in place. Detective Arroyo had 2 plainclothes officers already on the grounds, one positioned near the main entrance, one in the corridor adjacent to the ceremony space. Marcus Webb was in the parking lot in a rented silver sedan, waiting for my signal. "You don't have to be the one to do this," Mitchell said. "Not for the first time." "Yes, I do," I said. "Not for the first time either." At 10:40, Ronnie arrived with his groomsmen. He looked wonderful. Dark suit, white boutonniere, nervous in the best way, the way people are when they are about to start something they believe in. He came and found me and hugged me and said, "Mom, you look beautiful." I straightened his boutonniere. Old habit. "You ready?" he asked. "Almost," I said. They seated the guests at 11. About 110 people in those white-dressed chairs on the stone terrace. The late morning sun coming through the oak canopy at a lovely angle, light the way only November light manages to be. The string quartet started. The groomsmen came out. Ronnie took his place at the arch, and I watched him from my seat in the front row, his face forward, his hands relaxed at his sides. He had his father's shoulders, the same way of standing when he was trying to be calm. The doors opened and Cassidy appeared. She was extraordinary. I will give her that, and I say it with completely cold clarity. The dress was everything it had promised to be. The structured ivory bodice, the cathedral train trailing behind her on the stone, her auburn hair pinned up with small white blooms. She carried herself like a woman who had been practicing this moment for months, because of course she had. She moved up the aisle. Ronnie's face did what faces do when someone you love walks toward you. I watched it happen, and I felt a tearing sensation that I set aside immediately. The officiant welcomed everyone. She went through the opening. Something about the courage it takes to love, the trust it requires. Cassidy faced Ronnie and they held hands, and it all looked entirely devastatingly real. And then the officiant said, "If anyone here has cause to object..." I stood up. I didn't shout. I didn't make a scene in any dramatic way. I simply rose from my seat in the front row and I said clearly and steadily, "I'm sorry. I need a moment before we continue." The silence was immediate and total. Cassidy turned her head. When she saw it was me, something flickered in her eyes. Quick as a blink. Impossible to miss if you were looking for it. Not surprise. Calculation. She was already running the angles. Ronnie said, "Mom, I'm sorry, sweetheart," I said. "I truly am. But there's someone here who needs to be part of this conversation." I nodded toward the back of the terrace. The main doors opened. Marcus Webb walked in. The color left Cassidy's face, not gradually, all at once. It was remarkable, actually. The specific, absolute absence of blood from a person's skin when they understand in one instant exactly how wrong things have gone. "Hello, Cassandra," Marcus said. He stopped at the end of the aisle. His voice was perfectly quiet. "It's been a while." What followed was not a movie moment. It was messy and human and embarrassing and loud in all the wrong places. Cassidy's first move was composure. She turned back to Ronnie and she smiled. That same warm, practiced smile. And she said, "Ronnie, I don't know who this man is. I think your mother has—" "My name is Marcus Webb," Marcus said from the end of the aisle, completely calm. 3 years ago, you called yourself Cassie Morell. You used my business license to commit financial fraud across 4 states. There are 2 federal complaints with your name on them." He said it like he was reading from a document, which he mostly was. "Ronnie," Cassidy said. "There are also," Marcus continued, "email records between you and Dennis Farrell going back to April, documenting your plan to drain Beverly Hutchins's savings and Ronnie's investment accounts in the 48 hours following this ceremony." Someone in the seated guests made a sound. Someone else said something to the person next to them. The string quartet, to their credit, sat very still. Cassidy dropped Ronnie's hands, and she pivoted. Not toward me, not toward Marcus, but toward the side exit. It was the action of someone who had planned escape routes. She'd probably identified that door the first time she walked through this venue, but she had her phone in her hand. She pulled it out and she was typing, presumably to warn Dennis, presumably to get the accounts moving before everything locked down. That's when the 2 plainclothes officers stepped forward. The lead officer, a woman in a dark blazer, said, "Cassandra Poole, I'm with the Financial Crimes Division. I need you to step to the side with me, please." Cassidy stopped moving. She looked at the officer. She looked at me. She looked at Ronnie. And for a moment, just a fraction of a moment, something real passed across her face. I don't know what it was. It wasn't regret. It might have been the specific kind of fury that comes from being outwitted by someone you had completely underestimated. She went with the officers. She didn't make a scene. She was too controlled for that. She walked through the side exit without another word. Dennis Farrell was picked up 40 minutes later at his apartment, where apparently the sudden silence from Cassidy's phone had prompted him to start moving money in a panic, which, as Detective Arroyo later told me, was exactly the kind of self-documenting behavior that makes a financial crimes case very easy to prosecute. On the stone terrace at Hawthorne Ridge, in the middle of 110 stunned guests, Ronnie stood at the altar for a long moment after she was gone. Then he turned around, and he found me. He walked to me slowly. The guests parted without being asked, the way crowds do when they understand something real is happening and do not want to be in the way of it. He stood in front of me and he looked at my face for a long time. I didn't say anything. I let him look. "Mom," he said at last, "we need to talk." "I know," I said. "But first," he reached over and lifted the pearl necklace gently from around my neck. He looked at it for a moment, then he took my hand and placed the pearls in it and closed my fingers around them. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I held the pearls in my closed hand and my hands were shaking slightly. Gerald's mother's necklace, 4 generations, still in the right hands. "How long have you known?" Ronnie asked. "I started suspecting about 6 weeks ago. I had a real lead confirmed about 2 weeks back." He nodded slowly. "And you didn't tell me." "I tried to think about whether there was a way to tell you that would have worked, that you would have believed." I held his eyes. "Is there?" He was quiet for a while. "No," he said finally. "I would have accused you of exactly what she'd been setting me up to think, that you wanted to keep me for yourself." He looked away. "God, she was good." "She was a professional," I said. "This wasn't about you personally, sweetheart. You were a target, a carefully chosen, thoroughly researched target. There was nothing about this that reflects on who you are." Around us, something had begun to shift. 110 people who had come for a wedding and received something entirely different were beginning, slowly, to settle back into themselves. The venue coordinator had quietly spoken to the bar staff. Bottles were being opened. The string quartet, bless them, had started playing again. Something low and jazzy, nothing wedding-like at all. Ronnie looked around, and then he did something that made me prouder of him than almost anything in his life before it. He straightened his jacket. He found his groomsmen, and he started making rounds, going table to table, shaking hands, apologizing for the morning, accepting condolences and deflecting pity, with a steadiness and humor I hadn't known he had in him. I watched. "She never saw you coming." After he left, the terrace settled into something I hadn't expected and couldn't quite name. The guests had stopped being stunned and started being human. There were real conversations happening, the kind that weddings usually prevent, all that formal choreography getting in the way of actual connection. I saw people who hadn't spoken in years finding each other. I saw Ronnie laugh, genuinely laugh, at something his friend Derek said. The bar was doing brisk business. Somewhere around 2 in the afternoon, Ronnie came and found me by the garden wall. He had a glass of champagne in each hand, and he gave me one. "You okay?" he asked. "Tired," I said. Relieved. A little sad for the reasons it's sad. He nodded. We stood together for a moment. "She really thought you were just a nice older woman who wanted her son to be happy," he said. "That's what she told Dennis, apparently. That you..." We stood and watched his guests, our guests, move around the terrace in the warm November light, talking and eating and finding their way through the strangeness of the afternoon. "Next time," he said, "I'm introducing her to you on the first date." "Next time," I said, "I'll bring a notepad." He laughed. Then he raised his glass and said, "To Dad." I raised mine. "To your father. Who would have loved this?" We drank, and for the first time in 6 weeks, I felt the weight of it go. Cassandra Poole and Dennis Farrell were charged with wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and financial exploitation of an elder. That last charge because of my age and the amount they'd taken from me, which qualified under state statutes. The federal complaint Marcus had been tracking for 3 years was reopened and folded into the case. As of the last time I spoke with Detective Arroyo, the prosecution was describing it as strong. The wedding venue deposit was complicated. Most of the money I'd spent on the wedding was gone. Vendor fees, the dress, the flowers. Those vendors had delivered their services in good faith, and I wasn't about to pursue them. But Marcus's civil attorney filed a separate action against Cassidy and Dennis that included damages from my losses as well as his, and there was preliminary word from the court that assets had been frozen. I may get some of it back. Maybe not all. I've made my peace with the number. My house is still my house. That's what I told myself to hold on to. Ronnie took some time in December. He drove down to the coast for 2 weeks, stayed in a small rental, walked on the beach every morning, apparently. He came back looking clearer than I'd seen him look in years. He went back to work, picked up some projects he'd been letting slide, started seeing his old friends again, the ones Cassidy had quietly, methodically reduced contact with over the previous months. He called me every Sunday, same as always. In February, he mentioned almost offhand that he'd met someone at a barbecue at Derek's house. He said it in the careful, bright voice I'd heard back in October, the one that tells me this isn't just a friend from work. I waited. Last week, he called and asked if she could come for Sunday supper. He said her name was Ruth. He said she was a landscape architect and that she had a dog named Biscuit and strong opinions about regional cooking and a laugh like she didn't care who heard it. I said, "Of course, I'll make pot roast." He said, "Mom, be normal." I said, "Ronnie, I am always normal." He knows me well enough to be slightly worried. That's appropriate. I am his mother. I have earned the right to watch carefully the second time around. The pearl necklace is back in Gerald's wooden box on my dresser. I took it out once last month just to hold it. It has that particular warmth that old jewelry has. The warmth of all the hands it's passed through, all the women who wore it on days that mattered. I put it back. I closed the box. It'll keep. The right person will come. I'll know her when I see her. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from, or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.